Another thing that you want to be thinking about is how to encourage your employees to have their own disaster plans for home. How do they prepare their family? How do they make sure that their family is taken care of? And here's the nice thing about this, to think about this in this way. When your employees know that their family is safe and sound, they can get back to the business of helping the company survive the disaster, whatever that is. So it is important for people to say, is my family okay? Great. They have their meals, they have their water, they have a place to be, they're safe and sound. Now I can help my business recover and get back to things. And I can completely relate to that. My own 9/11 experience, the first thing I wanted to do was make sure my mother, who was at Newark Airport, had not taken off and that she was fine, that my daughter was safe and sound at school, and I didn't have to worry about that, and that my spouse at the time was safe and sound at home and not running around. So those are the things that you know and you want to check in on first. When those things are fine, then you can focus on your own issues that you've got to deal with in terms of preparedness or reacting to the crisis you're dealing with, or helping your company to deal with whatever issues they need to deal with. So whether it's a company-related issue or your family-related issue, getting these things off the plate and knowing that really now everybody's safe and sound. Now all I can do, now what I need to do is focus on, my company and what we need to do to get back up and running properly. So your plan has to be inclusive. You want to make sure that you've got a plan that takes into account people's who have illnesses or disabilities of some sort, whether it's a hearing disability, a sight disability, health disabilities, people who might have diabetes that need regular medicine, any one of those sorts of things. It's important to kind of assess the strengths and weaknesses of your employees when it comes to giving jobs to people. The last thing you want to do is give to someone who gets very hypersensitive to stuff, or who may be emotional in terms of responding to things, to give them a job where they have to stay calm, cool, and collected. And there are some people that are just better suited for disaster management than others. And so you want to make sure that you are handling that accordingly. Everyone can and should contribute, but you've got to figure out what are people's strengths and weaknesses around that specific issue. This is a big issue. Communication has to happen in a disaster and can be challenging to do in a disaster. The communication fails are part of the issues that compound the problems when you're in a disaster. So always plan for the fact that communication is not going to be readily done. Have backup plans in place for communication. You can't always assume that your cell phones are going to work. On 9/11, all the cell phone towers were on top of the towers that fell. So you couldn't use your cell phone to call people very easily because the signals had to bounce to other antenna, and then suddenly you had a larger jam up of people trying to go through antennas to be able to get calls out. So it was a big issue. One of the things my ex-husband did in Lower Manhattan was to get the telecom up and running for the stock exchanges and the Federal Reserve banks and things like that, making sure that we could get businesses up and running again. And he was responsible for figuring out how to get mobile antennas in and how to get mobile cell phone coverage in. And so he brought in all sorts of antennas and things to get business up and running. And if we couldn't get businesses up and running, the economy would have ground to a halt worse than it already did. So always have some sort of backup plan. And that backup plan is not just about the communication and how you're going to communicate, but who you have to communicate to. For example, in terms of suppliers, shippers, customers, who's going to make the phone calls to those people, letting them know what's going on and letting them know how you're going to divert supplies or people or services to your customers. So you do need to make sure that you have a plan in place for what you're going to communicate and to whom you'll be communicating it. Moving on to the next slide is the cyber problems in terms of keeping your computer safe. Do you have a cyber expert on site that knows how to deal with cyber crimes or cyber disasters and things like that? Do you have a backup person for that person in case something happens to that original person? Do you have a backup plan for where your data is? And what are you going to do if your system's compromised? What are you going to do if somebody breaks into your system and says, we've compromised all your data, we've stolen all your, your credit cards and your social security numbers, where do you go from here? And this is cyber crime and cyber problems are a growing phenomenon, and they're not going to get better and before they get worse. So it's important that you spend an enormous amount of time focusing on, how to address all the cyber issues in your company, so you have a plan in place to manage that or to shut things down as quickly as possible if you've got a breach somewhere. In managing a crisis, it's always important that you have a plan in place to communicate, but part of that plan in place means asking some hard questions before you open up your mouth. Number one, what did we know? Number two, when did we know it? And number three, what are we going to do about it? So we need to know what we know, and we need to be able to say when we knew what something occurred. Because when you have a crisis, whether it's a crisis of terrorism or crisis of a natural disaster, people are clamoring for information. Everybody's clamoring for information. The public's clamoring for it. Your company is clamoring for it. Customers, suppliers, your board, everybody's clamoring for info. So you need to know what you know, when did you know it, and what are you going to do about it? Stakeholders are key, and you need to have somebody that is going to talk with all of those key stakeholders, somebody who's assigned to your board, somebody who's assigned to other investors, to customers and clients, to advertising agencies. And there's just a whole variety of stakeholders that you really need to consider in context. So it's important that we deal with that. We have to be able to figure out then what does each person need to know at a minimum, right? Does it mean that you tell them everything? No, you don't have to tell everybody everything, but you need to tell them the information that's relevant to them. Customers need to know who's going to handle their stuff and how quickly you're going to be able to get to it. Your board of directors needs to know when is business going to be up and running and what are going to be some of the challenges that we're going to face that are going to affect us legally and profitably. Employees want to know, are we going to get paid? Something as simple as that. So we have to figure out what we can share and when we can share it and to whom we can share it. So, crises come in stages. There's sort of the initial shock, and then as we start to gather information, we have more information to share. But again, we want to be careful of not sharing everything that we know blindly, particularly when we're still not clear what it means. That's the problem of being in a situation with ambiguity. We might err on the side of either not sharing enough, which frustrates people, or sharing too much and having a lot of speculation go on, which is not going to help either. So you really do want to have a fine line between too much and not enough. Lastly, again, we want to make sure that your stakeholders have an opportunity to ask questions. So having a hotline or having a situation where people can go to an email website and be able to get their questions answered would be really helpful. 8-hour window. If you capture what has happened, who is impacted, and what you intend to communicate with a clear plan, you have to do this within about an 8-hour window. And if you can get that done in that 8-hour window, you really have a good foundation for good recovery. The first 8 hours are the most critical. Because again, we need to know what's going on. We need to know why it happened, and we need to know how we need to put fires out, figuratively or perhaps literally, and be able to have a plan in place for helping people to recover and move forward. Our next slide, what do we have to think about in terms of that 8-hour window is, first of all, having a fact sheet available. So your spokespeople have something that they can read off of, that they can refer to. They're not speaking off the cuff, because that's a bad plan. So you always want to make sure you've got scripting in place for people to read to the media, to read to next of kin or witnesses or victims. but you want to make sure you've got a fact sheet about all the issues that are important and are relevant and ready to go. And as it needs to be updated, get it updated right away. So your communications people should be focused on what we know and getting that information updated and making sure that those resources are getting sent to the people who can most readily use the help. You want to have somebody who's going to be in contact with law enforcement and other security people to deal with all sorts of things. And you want to make sure that law enforcement knows the facts, what happened, when it happened, what do you think was the cause, because you want to work with them to be able to talk to, if there are victims and survivors' families, we need to be able to communicate through first responders to help us to manage those communications. In terms of your next slide on the 8-hour window, we want to begin to outline a draft response to those big three questions. What did we know? When did we know it? Et cetera, et cetera. So we should have our communications people in place working on these sorts of things. We should also make sure we've got the telephone people or our website people ready to go to be able to answer people's questions as quickly as possible. We need to get messages out to people as quickly as possible. We need to make sure we have a consistent spokesperson. Could this be the CEO? It absolutely could, but it doesn't have to be, right? Sometimes having a spokesperson for you, if it's your communications director, if it's the VP of something, it could be the chairman of the board, it could be anybody along the line that's a representative of the company, but someone that you know has good presence in front of the media, can take questions, can have a calming effect on folks. That's the person that would be ideal for your spokesperson. Moving on to slide 23, as part of that 8-hour window, who are you going to communicate first? Will it be your customers? Will it be your employees, or will it be the state and local regulators? It depends on the disaster, clearly. If there is, a physical disaster, your employees are your first priority. If it is an ethical disaster or a reputational disaster, you may have to go to state and local officials to deal with the legal ramifications of things. And then the information gets spilled out to your consumers, your employees, your board, and on down the line. And as I said, make sure that you are addressing the needs of each stakeholders. Employees want to know if they're still going to get paid. Customers want to know when their product is going to get shipped or when you're going to show up at their site to deal with the software upgrade that you promised you would do. The media also needs to know because they are informing the community about what's going on. So they have a need to know as well. But again, we want to be careful of making sure that we are not going to the media too soon if we don't have facts to give them. We don't want to go to them with speculation. So slide 24, in terms of the 10 pillars of business community, I think these are great rules of thumb that you should follow. Number 1, respond to customers and victims personally and rapidly. You can never over-communicate to those who've been injured or affected or impacted by a serious incident. Number 2, informing your employees, contractors, and vendors what is expected of them. So they need to know how they're going to be affected, and they need to know what they can do to support you. So it's really important you get that information out there right away. Number 3, launching your off-site IT recovery before system failures force you to do so. So if you know that you've got some instability, fires, local hazards, make sure your off-site IT plan kicks in immediately. Send somebody out to get it managed and up and running, assuming that it's safe to do that. But getting that, cybersecurity is really important for many companies. Item number 4, authorizing your finance department to continue salaries and benefits throughout the disaster is approved by senior management. And this is one of the things that Cantor Fitzgerald did after 9/11 is even though they had a lot of employees that died because that's where the plane hit, one of the planes that hit the towers, they continued to pay salary and benefits for a while to all of the surviving spouses of those people, so that there was, for a while, there was at least some continuity. And even for companies that didn't have people who died, they still continued to pay, despite the fact that there may have been a stop in business or a slowdown in business because of the disaster. They still continued to do that, and I think that's important. If you've got deep enough pockets, you can do that. If you have disaster recovery insurance, you can do that, right? You want to make sure, number 5, that contradictions to policies and rumors are kept to a minimum. This is why you don't go forward with information unless you know things to be true. So you can give factual information, but it's really hard when you start speculating on things. You can't speculate. You have to have facts and deal with facts. Number 6, engage a qualified psychological counselor or EAP to offer on-site groups and individual counseling to those impacted by any tragedy. After 9/11, I know that was a big issue in New York. Anybody whose family was affected by the tragedy, anybody who had an opportunity to get counseling was encouraged to go out and get counseling as quickly as possible. Number 7, offering updates to key organizational leaders, investors, and regulators 3 times a day. So a plan for first thing in the morning, midday, and in the evening at the end of the day, letting people know what's going on, what happened, where are we at with progress, what are some known issues, pending issues, and milestones that we've hit. So keeping information going out there, not speculative information, but factual information is really key. Validate that your vendors and suppliers will deliver what they need, what you need to accelerate your recovery. So let's say you had a fire or you had a flood. You want to make sure your vendors and suppliers are still going to provide you with things so you can still continue to do business. You can still reach out and get information to your customers. I mean, that's important. Number 9, conduct scenario testing before you declare the disaster over and you resume business. So this may not be in all circumstances, but let's say we've got a problem with a computer glitch. So we can't say, oh, we got it fixed now, and then have the thing break down again. So you want to make sure before you say problem solved, we're back in business, that you have gone through and tested and retested all different kinds of scenarios, that you've pushed your issues to the limits to know that everything is going to be fine. Number 10, conduct a detailed post-crisis assessment of recovery and success, system failures, and opportunities to improve. So people want to know after the event, sort of what's our debrief? You know, how well did we recover? How successful were we? Where did we have failures? Where did we have successes? And how could we improve? So it's always important after a crisis, like anything, right, to evaluate how we responded to it and see what we could do to fix it to be better in the future. So that's the last of the material on crisis management, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.